on my computer.
No.
All right. That
That is also not your computer. Oh, there we go.
nice. All right.
Check.
Hi, everybody. Hello. How's it going?
Check.
Check, 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 check. All right, great. Oh, can we do that?
Yeah.
Oh, it's fun.
Yeah.
Hey.
Wow.
Wow, that is very intimate. Wow, that is very intimate.
Good
Okay.
lighting.
Hello.
Anyone else? Beverage?
I'm good. Oh, cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you guys for coming. Should we start?
Yeah, let's start.
Okay. My name is Harriet Salmon. I'm the host of a podcast called Craftsmanship. I want to first thank Brooklyn Research for this talk series, for hosting tonight, and for being our torture victims this night. But I was kind of hoping that you guys could introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about your experience and your technical concentrations.
Sure. I mean, I guess. Well, I'm Alex Dodge. I'm one of the three founders of Brooklyn Research. Johnny Liu, Azer. I'll just say a little bit about myself, and then they can say where they came from. My background is fine art. I studied painting, and then lived in New York for a number of years, and then eventually decided to finally go to grad school. And I decided not to do an MFA. I went to a program at NYU called ITP, which is sort of a hard to describe program. I guess it's maybe interactive technologies of some sort. So it's creative, but it's also technical. It's also code heavy, hardware heavy, depending on what people want to make it. And that's how I met these two guys. So that's kind of...
All right. I'm Johnny Liu, Esquire. I have a computer science and film background. I also went to ITP. It was very exciting. I had not touched computers for a very long time between my undergrad and going to ITP because I hate computers.
Look at you now.
Look at me. Really trapped myself into a golden cage or something like that. But anyhow, I like stuff now, like computers, so I'm good. I'm cool.
I'm Azer Longinus. My background was mostly music and music performance, which is probably one of the most, probably a stupid degree that I could have done better with in undergrad. But I went to Bard College there and was sort of building a lot of electronic pieces there. And it sort of grew into what is now, when I went to ITP, doing more like electronic and EE work. So building a lot of circuits and things, and where it started with like audio and performative audio type things, and then sort of grew into digital electronics, and then building sort of systems and working with these guys to help others, artists, entrepreneurs, and institutions to build like custom devices and programs and things.
I guess we could talk about like the origin story of Brooklyn Research, which was not in any way really planned, in the sense that we didn't really have a clear vision. In many, I mean, I guess like the most important thing from the very, I guess, but though from the very beginning, though, there were always kind of two entities, like in the sense that there was a for-profit side and there is a nonprofit side, and those were fairly early on something that we thought we wanted to do. However, we didn't really understand what the nonprofit was supposed to be doing for a few years out. But the for-profit side was something that really the three of us fell into. And I think that the main thing was that whereas a lot of the other friends that we had from grad school were going to places like Google, Microsoft, fairly standard kind of corporate trajectories. Yeah. And then, I mean, I think that we were, among other things, being good friends, we just didn't feel like we wanted to go into that space and go into the corporate kind of track. So we ended up sort of scrounging for work wherever we could find it, and eventually we got handed a job that another friend from ITP couldn't do, and it was a pretty weird thing from a creative agency called I forget who the agency was, but the client that was who was
It was relevant.
was
for New
relevant.
Era.
Oh, it was relevant. Yeah. So relevant was like a creative agency, and they had a client, New Era, making popular hats that people leave the tags on and stuff like that. And they wanted to have something for the Super Bowl as a promotional thing, where you could go into a booth, and essentially there would be a system that would predict your hat size without touching you. And I think we were pretty desperate for work, and we were like, oh yeah, sure, we can do that. And after the initial kind of ideas of like using some kinds of imaging technologies like infrared or millimeter wave, and all these ideas of trying to see through people's clothing and hair to be able to kind of figure out on an optical level like how big their heads were. We realized none of that stuff works because even hair has a heat signature for the most part, and millimeter wave, which would have done it, was just not something that we could build on our own in that much of time. I mean, like also the time frame here was like, what was it?
I think about a month.
It was about a month to do
Wow.
this. So
It was also extremely expensive to buy a lot of that equipment, so we had to do it for a very cheap price. It was actually, we actually didn't know what we were doing, so we actually had someone come back around and say like, hey, your price is too low. I'm afraid that the company won't take your bid just because this looks ridiculous.
they were scared. I mean, because we didn't know how to price anything at that point. We're like, well,
Were you guys a formed company for this, or did you?
No,
I don't think that we were technically formed at that
we
point.
were.
Yeah.
I think we were technically
Maybe
formed
we
for
were.
the insurance.
Oh,
Well,
okay,
one of the
yeah.
things is that
Yeah.
to take the space, we needed insurance for
That's
the
true.
landlord,
Yeah, yeah.
and no one wanted to put that under their name, which is reasonable. And so we formed a company, and that somehow then had to go on a contract together, and then somehow now we are a company.
7 years later.
Was that this space, or were you guys?
Yeah.
It was
It
the
was a
smaller
space.
space. Like, so at some point we expanded, but so in any case, like with that job though, the cool thing that really came out of it was, I think the ability for us to disagree, but eventually synthesize something that really did work. And so we ended up taking a really interesting kind of tack on it, which was Johnny and Azer really figuring out how to use a Kinect camera that was able to give us basically real-world scale, so we'd know the distance that someone was, and then we could use that using the infrared, but then using the normal vision camera or the RGB camera to actually track the facial features on someone. And so now this stuff is actually, many years later, like this is, China and a lot of other people using facial recognition to get identity and uniques from something like that. But at the time, we took that, and because we could get real world, size of like people's eyes, mouth, and the different measurements between that stuff, we found, my job was actually just doing research, trying to find data sets that would be usable. So we actually found what was called an anthropomorphic data set from the US military that had become declassified or open to the public.
Where do you find these things?
So that was actually, I think it was University of Michigan. It was on a
Okay.
server that they had, and so I was able to just grab the entire data set. And so from there, Johnny was able to take that, and we were using an R, which is
It's a programming language
for
for statistics.
statistics and for data exploration, really. And so we were able to create an equation that would use different things that we could measure with the camera and basically do a linear regression to figure out, well, we don't know what the head size is. And again, remember, this is just to get hat size. But we could figure out how to measure different parts of the face and then get a fairly good statistical model that would predict their head circumference. And it worked like decently within
Yeah, it
like,
worked fairly
like
well.
plus or minus half a
And there was
size,
also a
but-
lot of theatricality to it. There's like an entire like screen you're in front of, and then we would take like your a 3D projection of your face and spin it around, and then people would be like, "Wow!" And then people, I think Acer was out there at the Super Bowl, and someone was afraid that there was taking their DNA, which it is. I want to clarify. It's
Yeah.
absolutely taking your DNA, and I'm selling that data.
I mean, there's also, you can sort of see it here. The kiosk was called Fit Test, and there were a few people. It was set up in the Super Bowl in this, and as people were working by, they didn't really know what it was, and it just said Fit Test. And there's a couple people that were like, I already know it'll work out. I don't need to have this kiosk tell me that. And just like slump around. But the one thing that it worked about 75% of the time. Unfortunately, the outliers, which are like the NFL football players, didn't work so well with because they're outliers. So a lot of when they would have like famous football players to come to like check out what their hat size was, it would be like wildly off.
Because they're like
they're-
super athletes. So
They're
the
like, yeah, their
Statistically,
proportions
data
are just
set
like,
just didn't work.
yeah, it would be, yeah, their head size was generally pretty huge. And, they're just like, they don't really make hats like that. And you're like, I don't know, 7 5/8? I don't know. So those, like, in some of those, like, weird, like, key moments and stuff, it would be a little, like, odd. And also the president of New Era, it, like, never got his hat size right. It got everybody else in New Era's hat size right, but the president of New Era's didn't get it right.
Which just means he's an athlete.
Yeah, sure.
Good for you.
But other than that, it wound up working actually pretty well, and it was one of the more successful projects that we had, where it wound up like going not just to the Super Bowl, but the MLB Fan Fest. It went to a bunch of other sort of like draft, and there was a kickoff for a thing that this was going to be like a product that they wanted to build out.
So when you
Anyway.
when you talk about it as a product, do they own this now, or can you use some of the things that you created in other projects?
That was, I mean, I think that a lot of this kind of work, it's on the legal side of it, depending on the contracts that you get, they'll be, explicit that all code base, anything that you make, all IP, potential IP is owned by them. But oftentimes this stuff is very, 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 very loose the way that the contracts will go, where it's like, it's not entirely clear where a lot of that's, just kind of depends on who you work with, because we've worked with some people where it's like, yeah, seems like we can take this and keep on going with it on our own.
It's
so-
especially
Yeah.
true with events because they're not expecting this to have any legs to
That's
go
right,
on.
yeah. It's
How
very
much
short
of
term.
the stuff you work on is event-based?
I would say maybe about, monetarily like half, but time-wise maybe like a quarter.
Mm.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, maybe work hours, it's probably closer to half too, because a lot of the event stuff is fairly time compressed.
Mhm.
So you wind up working a lot harder
Oh, that's
under a
true.
shorter period of time,
Mm.
where some things are maybe a little bit more lax.
Has it ever not worked?
Oh yeah.
Come time of the event.
I think that's something to be said about that initial project it was not easy, but it was also the fact that we had a month and we pulled it off, and it was pretty remarkable. And I think that it kind of gave us some early confidence, maybe too much confidence in some ways, because in other subsequent projects, sometimes they don't work out, and sometimes it's really scary.
But
'cause,
I want to clarify, for the vast majority of the time, it does work
It
out.
does.
We are very
or,
hireable.
or you're able to fix it.
And
Yeah.
we are
So,
much
yeah.
better now than we used to be. Not that we're bad in the past. We were
No.
stellar in the past and stellar now.
I mean, making a thing that's never been made before
That's
by an
tough.
immovable
Yeah.
deadline, you
Yeah.
can't succeed 100%.
They
at
should
the
have just
time.
moved the Super Bowl date.
Yeah. for this. Yeah, that does. It
No,
does
that
happen
worked.
where something. Generally, what happens is that it doesn't. It's a managed expectation of something. So, like, what the idea of what it is slightly different from like the final execution. There's only been very, very few times where it just didn't work,
Mhm.
and generally the reasons for that aren't necessarily due to us, but due to some other external factor that has, that either pushed us out of the. That there's like the installation date or something didn't happen, or something else canceled, or there was a massive failure on some other, like the Wi-Fi
Yeah.
just doesn't work. And so,
Yeah, I think that's another thing is like, when we were just starting out, to note to anyone who wants to get into this kind of work, which is that, oftentimes you can get bullied by the client in a way where, I think it took us a couple of years to really realize, learn how to stand up and say, or to manage expectations, say like that's not physically possible, and this is possible, and being able to push back on people when they're demanding things that are not possible within a certain amount of time, or just not possible
Like
by the
violates
the
by
law
the
of
laws
physics.
of physics. Yeah.
Can you talk about the kind of language you use when you're talking to a client? Like what things do they expect to be possible that don't work? Or like, is there a way you approach talking about integrated systems to people that maybe have high expectations of them?
I think it really depends on the client, honestly. Some clients are very aware of what, like, from a technical standpoint, of what it is that what they're trying to achieve, and then there's some that aren't. And it's a variant degree of like how knowledgeable that client is, and then it's kind of a corollary of like how knowledgeable they are about the topic that they want to build, and then also how recalcitrant they are about their idea. So if it's something where they have this idea and they're not that knowledgeable about it, they tend to be more adamant about it working and being amazing.
Can you talk about a project where they had an idea and it like transformed into something else during the conversation?
Oh, during the conversation. I think we've had ideas where there's, and Johnny can attest to this, where we had some installation work, and they were trying to figure out some ideas, of like how they're going to present something, and they've like sort of not stolen our idea, but like sort of taken some, whether it be like a projection on fog or something, or like doing something that's like non-standard that we were sort of presented with them with, and then all of a sudden.
Well, that's just like straight theft.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
But like it changes that, where it becomes as if like this idea that they had, that they were like working on for whatever presentation or display, then sort of morphs into like, that's what we've always thought, that kind of, and it's a little bit in the fog of like the conceptualization of like whether or not, how much of it was like preordained and how much of it was like us sort of pushing them along that route. I don't know if that really answers your question.
No, it does. Also, I feel like it sounds like your description involves a longer conversation of like pitching and a back and forth, which doesn't always happen in like fine art fabrication contexts.
That's true. I think sometimes the concept is more movable or malleable in a lot of these, especially, so I guess like one thing to just like mention is that we do a lot of work directly for artists, making work for artists, whether it's interactive work or work that just needs specific software or hardware expertise. So and then we do stuff for big clients, corporate people. So it is a very different dialogue when you're working with someone. Like when we do projects for Google, Google doesn't have the budget constraints that artists do.
Mm-hmm.
So that's never something that's that has to go back and forth. Whereas, the technical sides of the project are something that can be renegotiated. It's like, well, if you want this to be, so this was a project that we did with Google for International Women's Day, with trying to make something that would be fun for people coming to the conferences that they were sponsoring around the world. And in the end, we made like this thing that would print out a badge, an ASCII art badge with either an Ada Lovelace quote, or you'd have your own.
Well, it was like a speech to text.
Right,
Like, so,
yeah.
like ASCII art, if anyone's unfamiliar with that, it's that it would take an image of you and then convert it into like a plain text representation of it. So like all these, if you look at this image, these are all like actual like characters, like little, like A, B, C, 1, 2, 3 kind of stuff. If you look closely at it, that's not a close up. And so it would do that, and then it also would use speech to text where we would talk into the phone, and then they would transcribe that, and then would print this little badge for you as for the conference. And this is also an example of a project where we were basically just asked to give ideas, and they would choose one from the bucket, and they're like, "Can you do this one?" So this is one of, I think, 7 or 8 ideas we pitched to them in like a very short time frame.
Yeah, with the constraint being that time. I don't think budget was the issue. It was more just what can you pull off within the time
I think,
frame.
it wasn't so much a
Yeah.
budget, but it was also just like, how can you make the system, can you build the
Robust.
system and something that we can roll out around the world to, I don't know, 20 different locations or something like that simultaneously. So it was, it had to be fast, but also scalable and something that we could ship around the globe. So.
Yeah, it seems like robust means different things
Yeah.
for different
Yeah,
clients.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But one thing, yeah, actually, to answer your point, I think one of the things, the earlier question of things that sort of changed over time is generally a lot of the artist projects that we wind up doing, especially because they have a longer tail, as they start developing with the physical thing that we're building for them, it winds up defining their art or how they're going to sort of interact with it or how they're going to set up that interaction. And so that winds up changing over the period of it being built. So anything that we did for like London O'Connor, who's a musician, and his this reactive light piece that he was playing with, that sort of informs his programming. Oh,
cool.
There you go. So this is this cube that Alex built, this light cube that then informs the performance. But that was very much until it was built and we sort of work with it. That sort of helped him to focus that. Or
Yeah. Do you feel like once it physically existed, it gave him ideas and there was
exactly.
A back and
Yeah,
forth?
and
he
the-
came to it with ideas that were not really possible. We're like, well, we can't make it so that you can. We couldn't make the cube a full-on polyphonic MIDI controller, but we could do certain kinds of things that when you touch different sides of it, it would activate different parts of his MIDI for his live performances, and that's really what he wanted, to have something that would react, be able to be kind of playable, or at least to be able to fire cues for his live performance, and then also have this color sync with the music and things like that. So yeah, that was coming to us with certain ideas, and would say, well, yeah, this is what we can do, and then then he built his performance around it. So it became really a part of a tool that he started to work with in that way. Yeah.
Have you worked on projects with him since, now that he
Yeah,
kind of knows your capabilities?
I wish I had pictures of what I built.
The monolith?
The monolith, yeah. So the last one, I wish I had some of the sketches that but he basically came to us with this crazy idea. He was like, I want it to be like the monolith from 2001, but it folds down. First it's a backpack that's the monolith from 2001, and then it docks onto a dock on the stage, and then it folds down, and then the lid comes off. Oh, sorry, I forgot one of the steps, which is there's a laser that comes out and scans the audience.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And then it folds down, and then it opens up, and his keyboard's inside, and he sits down and then plays it. And at first I was like, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of things that we need to kind of put into
manage expectations.
Yeah, but then in the end, so we built it once, and we built it like a tank. It was way too heavy, not backpackable at all. And then I kind of realized that we needed to have version 2, and so I built it more like an airplane, thin aluminum, like aircraft aluminum. The whole thing was laser cut, bent, and then welded together. So it was super light chassis. That was backpackable, and it had his keyboard and a whole lighting system inside it. And he's used it in live shows where he'll walk out on the stage with these backpack straps, and then dock it and lock it in, and then it folds down, and it works exactly the way that he kind of envisioned it to. And it was sort of like he convinced me that was actually possible because, it just seemed like such an insane idea to do it. And then, we built it though. So.
Do you guys build all the hardware in this space, or do you use?
It's pretty limited. Our shop we have a small CNC, so I think that a lot of the work we can do tests for, but then when we go into real production, if we're doing laser cut metal, then we send it to people in Jersey that we work with, and then other shops in Brooklyn that we like to work with. So especially for something like that, I did all the designs and then send them out to different shops, and then have it, cut and welded at a different place, and then powder coated at a different place, and then everything comes back here for assembly. But yeah.
Cool. Do you always produce the hardware along with the technology, or sometimes you just doing the tech?
Like hardware
technology?
like circuits, or hardware like?
Both.
Okay. Well, Azer has been doing a lot of. He does most of the board design. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it tends to be that there's a lot of depending on what the use case is, because sometimes it's a very limited use case, or very weird ask of what they're, and so there's no one unit that sort of makes it happen. So it might be something for IT cosmetics, and they want the room to oscillate in different red colors, with these big dials that they have. And in theory, you could figure out some weird DMX system that you could buy that could sort of do it, but it also has to fit within this container and this thing. and it winds up like, yeah, you just build it. And so you wind up a lot of times, not because like I want to be a hero or anything. It's just that like it's the only thing you want to. Sort of has to be custom.
Mm-hmm.
Or if we did something for, I don't know what the next slide is. I don't know.
Well,
if
I
we
mean,
have-
I don't know. I could pull up Shire or something.
Oh yeah,
It's
if you have
like-
the Shire one where they wanted a matrix style. Oh no, Shire, the I one. That was also I think the other one. No, Abbott Cosmetics was or Abbott Chemicals was the jump sensor one. But yeah, the Shire, which is up here somewhere.
So
I'll
Shire
probably
was
show-
like they wanted. So this thing was
Whoa.
completely done in house in terms of the 3D printing, the hand finishing, and these were like these sort of headsets that would take pictures of your iris, and then do these visualizations. This is all for a. It was like a pharmaceutical that was doing like eye drops, and this was like this whole event that they did on the High Line.
Wow.
And so we built this crazy eye camera.
So it's taking the pattern of your iris and then
It was
producing a design from it?
It would
or-
do like
Yeah.
a color sampling of that, and then
Okay.
create like this visualization projection on this video animation.
So this is like a
based on that.
portrait of
Yeah.
the person?
Yeah,
Yeah.
roughly.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that was something that was like, completely customized to be able to do that. And that was a project that involved heavy on Azer's side doing the actual circuits to make the lighting actually work, and then on me like doing all the optics, which was a lot of work to make that. But then you also have this real physical level of interaction design to make sure that people look in the right place to take a picture, because people are going to look all over the place unless you give them like this visual cue to look here. So one eye would be looking at a logo that would give them the visual cue, and then the other eye would have a camera flash a light in it and take a picture really quick, and then give you a good, reliable iris picture. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you made the decisions for the visual based on what was the relation?
I mean, mostly it was just like getting something that was central. So you just
Mhm.
had to have something that was illuminated in the right way, and then people put on this thing, and then your intuitive. I think that there's also verbal cues that people give.
Yeah.
It's like, look at the logo, and then press the button, and then stuff like
But
that.
the pattern that was made from the iris, what were the rules?
We didn't actually do much of the actual software.
Okay.
So we did all the hardware on that. So,
So
that
for-
was,
Yeah, a lot of projects we were like on one portion of rather than the entire thing, and which portion we do, whether it's hardware, software, or electronics, that actually varies quite a bit project from project. Sometimes we
Mhm.
do like the whole farm to table. Sometimes we're just doing a portion of it.
Is there a project that you did? I love the term farm to table. Farm to table that you could talk about.
The Google one that one was definitely the entire project, which was, it was the ASCII art one.
in terms of
Similar,
like
right?
creative to.
Yeah, that went from actually pitching the idea to actually finishing it.
Yeah.
The entire thing.
Do you guys enjoy that process of being able to come up with ideas and then fulfill them, or do you what's the difference between
I
that
think
model?
that's the most fun thing to do.
Yeah, it's
If we could-
preferable.
Yeah, because and that's been the case. It's been great working with Google. A lot of stuff we've done with Google we can't show because it's not stuff that we can talk about. But that's been the great thing, is like being able to give ideas to people and then have them be funded and being able to carry them through to the end. That is really fun. For me, having a background in art, it is fun to work with other artists too.
Mhm.
However, it can be a real stretch because the budgets are not there always, and so it's oftentimes a compromise of trying to, or it just hurts to do it.
Yeah.
But it's fun, but it hurts. Yeah, so that's the reality, which sucks. But
What's your favorite artist project? Or you don't have to play favorites, but what with?
Which
a
child
really-
do you like the best?
We could. I don't know. The Mika Tajima. We've done a bunch of. We're doing one right now with Mika Tajima, but this one was really fun. This was a project in Long Island City that she got through Sculpture Center, and essentially it was a large pink bathtub-looking structure, and it was a temporary public sculpture that was up for the duration of a summer. And so, again, we did a certain portion of it. We didn't do the physical fabrication, but we did the code and integration to basically the color of this piece responds to the global index of gold that was being traded.
Yeah,
Or
like
something.
the change
the
of
change,
value.
the change of value, right?
Yeah.
So Johnny did.
Well, I translated it from an API that another person, Eric, worked on, and I would take that and translate it to color values
Right.
to program these.
And I was basically building built the LED system to figure out how to make an LED system that can get really wet. So the steam that is generated there is actually just water vapor. It's super high pressure atomized water that would create this steam effect. And then we had to create all this stuff is going to get rained on. It's going to be outside and beat up for 3 or 4 months. So I built like an LED system that could really take a beating and be submerged underwater for a long time.
This piece has to be robust for the time it's out,
Yes.
like
And
outside.
me and Azer actually built that. Yeah.
But then it also, it's an artwork, so then it
Yeah.
has to have a life. Like if it was bought or in a museum, can you talk about like making things for conservation or longer
Right.
lives in fine art versus like an event-based?
That's a big distinction because when we do make something for an artist, that in the case of this piece, it's possible that she might want to, bring this piece back to life in a different context. As it was only meant to exist for 3 or 4 months. But when we do make other work so this is a piece that that Johnny worked on heavily, which was real-time smoke simulation. So this is smoke that's being generated entirely on a simulated computer system that would react to, again, internet data in real time. And so, we were talking about that recently, the fact that, this thing, to be able to survive, to be able to, let's say someone buys it, how is it going to be able to last in perpetuity? And you go into multiple layers of what needs to be maintained, what does the artist intend. So I think the biggest thing is that, in terms of conservation in art historical conservation in institutional sort of standards, there's generally this two-sided kind of scope of looking at things, and it's either emulation or replication. Replication means that you have to rebuild the system or conserve that system, meaning software, hardware, the display technologies, all of this stuff.
So like in 10 years, you just rebuild the piece?
You'd have to source these things that may not be
Yeah.
easy to find. So like if you had a computer system that used a specific graphics card, you'd have to source that. If you were trying to be true to the artwork in the replication sense, or to replace it or to maintain it. Whereas like if you have the artist's consent to say emulation is fine, meaning that whatever can achieve that in some way is fine as long as it looks enough like that. So I think that oftentimes when you see work by artists like Namjoon Paik that those TVs just don't exist anymore,
Yeah.
then you have to figure out something else that's close enough. Whereas Johnny can talk a little bit more on the software side of a piece like this that he built, where it's just like it's you were using not officially supported code to be able to make it work, right?
Right. I was like using an experimental branch of code that's not officially supported because it was the only thing that I could use to achieve the effect at the time.
What does that mean if it's not officially supported?
Like it was never widely released. It's just something that basically a company decided that they wanted to experiment with this. And so I found it and I started experimenting with it. It was the only thing that could get me the results I needed at that time. The problem with that is that like 2-3 years later, this is much easier to do, but the code is stuck there. And if I wanted to upgrade that and change it over, it'd be an extremely large amount of work, and it would also be slightly different in a lot of small senses.
And it's just
What are some of the small
It's just
like different operating system? Can you talk
yeah,
about
it's like different so there's like a lot of layers. There's different hardware, which is like the computer itself. There's different operating systems, and like which version of like what operating system you have. There's different versions of the code that's built on, and then there's different versions of like other kind of libraries, I guess, the code uses that are no longer supported. So you have to have all these versions kind of aligned because they're all built for a specific time period and a specific kind of version of each other.
I mean, it seems like that problem is universal, not
Yeah.
just in like fabricating for a client, but like all technology. Are they constantly
Definitely, I mean-
chasing the moment that it was made in?
Well, I think one
They
thing to
are.
mention about like this one, that the code that Johnny was using is coming from technologies that are built for gaming, for video
Well, yeah,
gaming,
this
because
is the Unreal Engine. It's
Yeah.
based off the NVIDIA graphics card, and it's
Yeah.
basically it needs a certain kind of graphics card and a
Yeah.
certain version of it to run. And the way that I think some people are trying to conserve works like these, or purely digital works, is through what's called emulation, which Alex has mentioned before, which is like you are literally trying to mimic the exact kind of chips, like computer chips, and the way they relate to each other on a software level. And so like there's like a lot of Super Nintendo emulators. Some of those are great because they are so accurate that like when you're playing a game and the real Super Nintendo game would actually start chugging because there's too much things going on, it would like slow down, it would flicker. These emulators also replicate that because they're basically constrained to act as if it was the actual system.
So for like a layman, like
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
so you have a very powerful computer that's creating a controlled environment that
Right.
mimics the controlled environment of the
Right.
hardware and software of the time that you made the thing. So
Yeah,
it's like
it's-
a mini machine.
A machine that replicates as many attributes of that other machine as possible.
Okay.
So it's actually like, it's much more complex of a program because to mimic all these different hardware features going on is actually quite a bit of work. Anyhow.
But is it less work than making the whole piece again with current technology?
I think not necessarily. I think part of it is essentially that how much can you keep that fidelity if you remake it?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's all these small things like the algorithm. If I remake this, like the smoke might just be slightly different for something that's kind of embedded into this new version I made, and whether or not I can find out what that difference is and change it is kind of like unknown.
Yeah. Do you tell Mika that when you're working on this? You're like, this exists in this moment,
Yeah, I did.
but it'll be hard to recreate it 5 years from now.
Well, what I do is like I have a document and then I do backups of things and I try to list what I was using at that time. So if for some reason, like 100 years later, someone was like, I really need this thing right now, sorry, that was too sarcastic. Someone might really need this.
Yeah,
thing
it's like
in 100
that
years.
happens in art.
Uh,
yeah, I mean, but also like I think there's also interesting to back off another level and just like talk about the power politics and economics of what goes on between these things, because you have to understand that, you know, these technologies being made for video games, multi-billion-dollar industry,
Mhm.
they have certain things that are driving the development of these technologies that are not necessarily aligned with artwork or someone's specific artwork. So you can see how those trajectories and paths will go in one direction or the other, and why it can be very difficult to maintain something that is kind of sidechained or piggybacking on a technology that's not necessarily meant to do that. So.
I mean, on the other hand, it's also kind of nice that it is using commercial technology because if these
Absolutely,
like
yeah.
built like multi-million-dollar games, if they are to be preserved, I could probably maybe piggyback on parts of that.
That's very true, yeah.
Otherwise, if this is completely like proprietary, like I made this up, like from like scratch, no one's gonna go look at it and say, "Oh, I'll make this again." No one will care.
It's true. I mean, like, it's also, like, I mean, there are benefits to open source versus, you know, profitable, you know, commercially backed software projects. You know, it's highly unlikely that Photoshop and Illustrator, for example, will not exist in 10 years. But, you know, an open source project could very well just like run out of community, and it just might go nowhere eventually. So it's you know, there's also that.
Yeah, support your open source friends.
I mean, it's nice that you work in a community that does value that. Like, there's a lot of mean, there's maker culture that shares stuff, but to just be able to kind of exchange actual open source information seems like a really like a different way of working as a group than, say, I don't know if I could say that many like metal workers all come together and exchange techniques all the time. It's not such a like community-based group of people, maybe.
I feel like there are a lot of like websites now that are like YouTube videos of like some snotty like 17-year-old telling you how to do like really technical stuff now though.
Yeah.
It's very exciting. Like here's how you make like slime. I was like, oh, nice.
I watched that one with the Elmer's glue. And,
Oh
yeah,
my god, I
it's good.
love slime.
But there's also, I mean, there were like guilds and things like that
Yeah.
sort of existed that were precursors of that sort of open source.
But they're more protective, like guilds.
Yeah, but I mean, if you were a metal worker in that metal work, like if you
Yeah.
were, you know, again, there is, I think, some degree of that that's still within, like, you know, there's a lot of like collab spaces or other places that are sort of open to like that sharing of knowledge and not being that protective of like how you want to building or from a fabrication standpoint.
Yeah,
That's
it seems
not-
like it's becoming more popular
Yeah.
recently, again, maybe.
But some of it's also just like the limitation, or like not limited, but your innate ability of to. Some of it is just it's out like how good are you with your hands at building, at you know, craftsmanship or
I mean,
you know,
code also has a special place because it's like it's so easy to transmit that, and
Yeah.
copy and replicate that. Whereas a lot of like anything kind of physical handiwork or anything that requires like certain kinds of materials, that's less accessible.
yeah. If you don't have the tools to do it, you can't be a luthier just from like copying and pasting.
Yeah, you just from YouTube. I
Yeah.
mean, hearing you taking a data set from University of Michigan, you don't have to go to the University of
No,
Michigan.
yeah,
You can just find it.
And that wasn't the only data set. Like, I mean, it was just, like for that project, I first found an alternate data set that the CDC had. But in order to get anything from the CDC, we had to like go through so much red tape of filling out, forms of, disclosure forms just in order for them to give us facial 3D scan data, which it would have probably not been as good anyway. But yeah, you're right. Like there is a lot more stuff that is accessible.
What other places have you guys found stuff from? I mean, like the gaming, gaming graphics
like
and like
non-standard-
universities.
Like you mean like non-standard
Mhm.
methodologies to achieving our ends? I mean,
Like JSTOR or something? Or don't.
I don't know. I mean, some of it's just like upcycling stuff. So there's some products, or at least from my standpoint, there's some things that are like, there is like one time we did a project. I don't think we have it on here, but there's a helmet laying project we did that they wanted to have track people that were going in front of their store. This is when I went out to LA, and they had some issue where the lights weren't strong enough for whatever reason that they spec'd some lights for it and they weren't strong enough, and so then we had to run around and I wound up running around to this like guitar store, and it had this like crappy MIDI device that they got there, and I was able to like rip it apart and then use it for their like lighting controller, just because I knew that like you could sort of upcycle some of the stuff that this $20 part would allow for, this like NTech thing. And so then I could take that because I didn't have anything there. So there's some stuff that will round up like by you, at least from my standpoint, I can just steal something from something else sometimes, or in a pinch, just like take something that wasn't meant for its original purpose, and then like get it working for that.
Yeah. Are you guys ever brought in on projects, like say an artwork that needs to be changed, or like a second or third stage?
Definitely. I mean,
Yeah.
I won't name any names, but because oftentimes, especially if it's artwork by well-known artists that are electronically based, but are maybe not taken care of or conserved in the best way, then they have to call someone to fix it. And so that's been a really difficult thing, is to come in and look at other people's work. Oftentimes, companies that built it have gone out of business, and they left behind different versions of software, and you're not sure really where to start. And on one level, it's like doing a kind of this digital archaeology, going through things to figure out how they work. So that can be very difficult to figure out someone else's
Yeah.
work without understanding fully what they did.
Can I ask what digital archaeology looks like? Like, what do you?
It's like getting onto a computer that's running a version of like Windows 2000 or something like this,
Uh-huh.
and a lot of time in log files, looking at what's system logs and other kind of specific like software logs to figure out what's not working, or and then making a lot of guesses of how it was supposed to work.
So do you guys have computers that run really old?
Well, oftentimes, like, you find these things and they're still just, I mean, again, this goes back to Johnny's point about ancient software and operating systems, is that, if you're a collector, I don't want to dissuade collectors from collecting this kind of work, but when you do, please understand that part of it is, it's almost like having a pet or a living kind of entity that you have to take care of it. You need to upgrade it constantly. You need to maintain it in a way, backing up the systems in a way that can be restored. But for the most part, yeah, especially upgrading your operating system to a new version, upgrading the whole system to a new computer, maybe once every 5 years.
Wow.
At the minimum,
Oh.
something like that. So it's a huge investment buying the artwork initially.
But though that comes with its own risk, because if you upgrade your hardware,
Absolutely.
you can
No,
actually break
and
everything.
Going
So-
again to that, yeah. So
So I think part of the thing is
Yeah.
the most important thing is really to do the documentation, like write down what
Right.
the version of everything you have is, what the configuration of everything you have is, because at least you can, maybe one day someone can come back and configure it.
So do you give like a document when
Yeah.
you work on a piece? You're
Yes.
like, this
Yeah.
is your cheat sheet.
Yeah, and
This is
then-
your like instructions for the wall drawing style.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
good comments in the code, that's always important.
So it's like really important to have that, because anything slight up. So like if you did upgrade like every 6 months, it's very possible that one upgrade will break everything behind it.
And then at least you can step backward and try to
Hopefully, yeah.
hopefully, yeah.
Yeah.
But-
I mean, I think there's also, I've heard kind of the other bookend to the conversation that some artists are just like, that's the piece,
Yeah.
and it's in the gallery, and like,
Like
it
a
doesn't.
planned obsolescence.
Well,
Yeah.
also like paintings don't last forever either. They
They
can also
don't.
be
I mean,
destroyed.
I mean, I think that maybe that's another way. That's another way to conceptually approach it, is saying like, it's true. Oil paintings crack over time. Interactive projection. Works made in Flash will just.
It might actually be more beautiful when your computer starts
Yeah.
glitching the fuck out. You might be like, that was intended. That's
Yeah,
just wonderful.
I mean, you could just accept it. It's like, sorry, these things don't last that long. The technology that they're built with doesn't last that long. So you could do that. I think that probably, I know from a fact from working in a gallery for many years that collectors don't see it that way.
No.
Yeah.
So
And you guys have worked for museums.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Because normally for an object like an artwork, they would be in the mindset of it has to be perfect forever. But when you're working for them on like an exhibition design or something, what do they? Does that need to stay perfect forever, or is it just the run of the show and then?
It's usually just the run of the show, but they want you to package it so that in case it travels, it can still live. But there's usually not a requirement that it lives forever.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a project that we did at the Metropolitan Museum.
For the Met Gala, which I went to, by the way.
It was for the full exhibition, not
Who
just
did
the
you
gala.
wear?
But
Oh my
Yeah.
god, I looked fantastic. I also had really long hair.
It was for Charles
was
James exhibit
flowing.
at the Costume Institute.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are we not talking about me anymore?
Sorry.
So this was done with. This was actually, the idea was from Diller Scofidio Renfro, which is a preeminent architectural firm, and so we helped implement these robotic arms that will kind of move around with projectors mounted to them, and they were project things on top of these beautiful, I guess, dresses by Charles James. And then on the bottom there would like be information displayed about it, and sometimes it would like pretend that the projector was a camera, and there were these beautiful renderings on the bottom. And so it would like set at certain places, and then it would kind of like focus your attention and project onto that dress and kind of show you like maybe like a kind of idea of like what the skeleton and the ribbing of the dress looks like and stuff.
But it was
that.
like, I mean, I think you're understanding how like complicated the work you were doing was, because it was kind of a beautiful hack, because what was happening is that you had a video of an image that was being projected on a 3D object like a dress, and that had to be space warped so that it would look like it was scanning the dress and revealing something underneath it. His dresses had tons of crazy boning and structure that was in there, and so it was almost like the projector was acting as though it had like this X-ray vision through the dress. So that had to be, the video had to be accurate in terms of spatial accuracy of the way that the projection was being distorted on top of a 3D body, but then it also had to be accurate in terms of the motion track that the robotic arm was taking. So a lot of those things had to work just perfectly for the illusion of the projector to really make that happen.
Could it respond to the dress if it was in a different position? Like,
You'd have to
did-
make new
No.
content. but yeah.
Yeah.
These were pre-programmed because there wasn't a sensor on them. Maybe today, or if we had more time, you could actually have sensors on them that dynamically responds to it. But at that time, it was all pre-programmed. But it took a long time to program.
I mean, it was a cool hack, and it's like a trick, but it works beautifully when it worked. So
Yeah, it did work.
it did work.
It's
Yeah.
fantastic.
But yeah, for the museum, a lot of stuff that we wound up doing, the documentation is pretty important for that,
Yeah.
for us to have, for it to exist, and but a lot of times the run of the museum pieces are like 6 months or something along those lines, or anywhere from like 1 month to 6 months or something along those lines, with the idea that it might be pulled up again. But
Yeah. I mean, if
Um,
that arm's moving every day for 6 months, though, that's a lot of
yeah,
wear.
and so you also have to spec out the equipment that, like,
Yeah, I mean,
with a
those
lot
were
of it.
real
Yeah.
robotic arms that were made for
They're
industrial
industrial.
use. So yeah, so they were okay with that kind of duty cycle. But
Yeah.
But yeah, that's where you have to sort of acknowledge.
yeah.
Yeah. This was another museum piece that we wound up doing for the Jewish Museum. I don't know why I'm talking about it, because Johnny actually did the lion's share of the work on this one.
Your voice is beautiful.
Thank you. Do you want to explain what this is, Johnny?
Oh, me? Okay.
Yeah, since
Um,
you worked on it.
this is also with Diller, Scufurio, and Renfro, and so it's like essentially this projection screen that moves above a map that's a layout of architecture of the glass house.
Pierre Charo.
By Pierre
Yeah.
Charo, not the Glass House by Philip Glass. Wait, that's not true. And so it would kind of pretend that it's scanning through the house by moving over pieces of the architectural blueprint, and then it'd be like, I don't know if you've ever seen like a digital camera in a video game, and you're kind of like clipping through.
Or like a
things.
CT scan
Yeah.
for like a brain.
Mm.
And so you could see this cross section of the house, and then kind of get an idea of like where, at certain points, this house would look like if you chopped it right through the middle. And at certain points, it would stop, and these projections with these like cute little vignettes of people using the house would play on the left and right side. There's also like this little like laser scanner.
So
would,
that
like,
wall
scan
moved back and forth?
Yeah, it's just like a projection screen with two projectors on both sides, and so you could look at it from both angles.
Yeah.
So that's one. But I think this was also a temporary exhibit. But if we wanted to talk about longer-term exhibits, this is supposedly, well, not, is this a video?
Yeah. This was a thing we wound up designing for the Tech Museum, which is still operational.
With local projects.
With local projects.
Who did most of the design, but we did a lot of the kind of end-game fabrication and electronics.
Yes.
So this is like in San Jose in the Tech Museum, and this is like a children's museum based around technology and science, but it's intended, as most children's museums, for the exhibits to last for very long years, and so things have to both be child resistant and just be able to last. So.
So what it actually is there's this unit that you can sort of see them playing with here, and there's a little rubber, what we call devices that would then loop back into each other, which would create sentences. So essentially, like if you connected three of them together, it would be when it sees red.
It's sort of like simulating DNA.
Yeah.
So
It would-
those plastic things can be pulled apart and stick together?
Each
Yeah.
one would be sort of like a different word in a genetic sentence. So
Okay.
you could say attracted to red or something like that. And then the creature that it would be creating on screen would be attracted to red or repelled from red or something like that. And so you'd see immediate results of your genetic engineering.
And then there's a whole environment on the wall of all the creatures that have sort of been made via all the other people that have gone through it.
Oh, so there's like an archive of
Well, it's
past
not. It's more of like an
creatures?
environment.
Sort of like
Yeah.
an ecosystem.
Yeah, an
Cool.
ecosystem that sort of is then created from all these other sentences or DNA structures that are made from other, and it helps to give some idea for kids that are coming through of like how DNA sort of works in a very, not super reductive, but a little bit fairly simplified.
What is the lighting connections? Is that where they fit into each other?
So
or-
there was like a dock structure, and then there were these kind of sausage-like links
Mhm.
that would plug in. So I think that how many could you could do like a
You can do as many as you want.
Right.
So you could link a ton of different logical genetic
Yeah,
words
Make a
together.
mega
It's-
creature?
It's generally like 3 that they would link, and then each one has a different shape, and it's flexible, and it has this nice silicone feel, and they have this magnetic snap that they have. So it's like fairly secure, but I think it's like, it's such a good tactile feel to it. I think I was the only one that visited, and I think most of the children, all they wanted to do was make like a really, really long chain and beat each other with it. So-
But this was such an immense amount of R&D to make that magnetic connection have just enough pull that it would snap tight and kind of feel good.
Yeah, but
when
not
it
like
did.
pinch little
And
fingers.
not
or-
pinch fingers, but also be strong enough so that it wouldn't pull out, and to make the connection, the digital communication that would have to
Yeah, can
link
you-
all these things together.
Can you talk about what's physically inside that?
Azer can talk about that.
Object?
Yeah.
Well, for the device or for the
For the
little
device,
hub thing?
the-
So for the device, each individual thing, oddly enough, each of the devices, what they are is this, it's a temperature sensor, it's in them. We're not really using the temperature sensor, but it does have this weird ability there's a easy way of getting this ID or like uniform, like a unique ID for each of the devices. So each of the devices, they'll get like a little power and data, and they just have a unique ID to them. That is then goes back to a database that just says lets you know that this ID corresponds to create green or whatever the portion of the sentence is. And then in the hub itself is essentially a little brain that reads the ID
Mm-hmm.
of everything that's being connected to it and on what hub to where. And then once there's a loop is made, and it can detect when a loop has been made, like when you started one and then connected it to like that loop all the way to the end.
Oh, so to send the information.
Yeah, when
you had
you
to
like
have two hub
yeah,
connections.
exactly. So
Okay.
when two connections have been made on one loop or one sort of string, that has created a sentence, and then it knows that sentence has been created. And once that's happened, it then sends it out to a centralized computer that says, "Hey, this person has made this sentence via these objects, and now create the creature." And then that central database does like sort of the animations on the wall and a lot of the other sort of like visual feedback that's given for on the tablet and on the front-facing portion of it.
Can I also take this chance to plug Mike Knupfel, who is a Brooklyn Research member?
Yes.
And
Oh, he did amazing work.
he
on
did
that.
a lot of the design for manufacturing, and I also want to mention that so we are the commercial agency portion of it, but there's a much larger, I guess, the co-research space, which is a lot of members who are members of the nonprofit, and we do a lot of, I guess, insourcing.
How many members do you guys have?
15-ish.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so a lot of the times, a lot of the people here have like fairly exquisite skills in
Yeah.
certain things, and we grab them and ask them to like, hey, would you like to work on this project with us? Can you please work on this project with us?
That's great.
Be a member.
Nice.
I mean, it seems like you guys have created your own community through the nonprofit to help with the complications of projects like this.
I mean, I wish that we could claim that we had like this brilliant plan from the beginning, but I mean, it's worked
I
out
mean, you
that
said
way.
that the nonprofit was an early
It was, but I think
stage.
but it was something that we knew that we wanted to be able to do. We applied for nonprofit status very early on, and then we
Mhm.
got it. It took about like a year, I think, to get the approval, and then after that, we had a lot of meetings with the initial board, and we couldn't come to a consensus on how we wanted it to operate until much later, when we realized that we wanted it to be have a specific educational mission, and it still does that today, doing programming like this, public talks and also workshops and stuff
Yes,
like that.
like our workshop tomorrow on projection mapping, 7 o'clock. And
That's
our
gonna be a good
workshop
one,
on
yeah.
September 15th to use Fusion 360 for digital fabrication.
I mean,
Wow.
do you guys see this kind of outreach as not being available in other places? Like, where do you see the nonprofit space being in like a couple of years, ideally? Like,
I think one thing we've all wanted is, well, one thing that we've talked about is we want to do more kind of independent research projects or like group research projects. I don't mean independent in terms of like one person. I mean independent as in like kind of going along a trajectory that's a little bit less well traveled and trying to use kind of like fairly new recent commercial technology and try to find ways to do interesting things with them.
layman question, in that scenario, is there a client or are you self-driven?
I would say hopefully
Self-driven.
I mean, self-driven. I mean, the client is humanity.
Always.
But there
So-
could be like some like benefactor or somebody
It
that
could.
would.
I mean, I think we've come up with different models, right?
Yeah.
Like where what we've kind of dubbed research groups in the theoretical is that these are groups that have a mission in a specific kind of problem space or discipline. And, you know, the funding from that is either going to be something that we have to write grants for to get funding, or it could be privately funded through an institution or corporation or
Or a wealthy benefactor.
Yeah. But I mean, like, you know, for me, like I have my personal interests in wanting to start like a print research group on print technologies because I love making prints and using as much new technology to do that. Johnny has had some really interesting ideas about translation, machine learning and translation technologies for making people talk to each other that couldn't talk to each other in interesting ways.
Like physically can't talk to each other, or
No, I mean not necessarily physically, but yeah, that could be there. I don't know. I don't know if I'm supposed to expand on that.
if you want to.
Oh, it's gonna be great.
Okay.
Nice.
So yeah, I think that would be an ideal, is if we could be able to support things like that.
With a membership community.
I mean, I think the membership, I mean, I think it's also the way that we've kind of envisioned that as a future prospect is something that anyone could potentially come to us with a proposal for a research group.
Mm-hmm.
And then if it's something that we think has, you know, that feels credible or viable in that way, and that something that we think that we could be behind and try to help get funding for, that we'd love to be able to facilitate that and foster that kind of work. But, you know.
Cool. I think we're about time. If you guys have any questions, audience questions, in the front row.
Hi. You guys kind of laid the groundwork with who you are, where you come from, your backgrounds, which I found really interesting that you all kind of have such a diverse background, and you found yourself today working on these very, very particular projects. And I know it's not just the three of you, there's a whole team of people back there. But what do you find, or what have you found as interesting backgrounds besides just the straight coders or people who have a bend in technology that have been helpful in working on these, you know, totally varied projects?
I would say that it's oddly enough the people that generally have a very like one-tracked perspective on either development, they're coders or just engineers or just they're not very well-rounded, tend to actually work out less well, oddly enough, even though they might have a strong concentration in the field of the thing that we're trying to do. And it, oddly enough, those that have a little bit more generality or a little more like, you know, liberal arts style education or like temperament seem to work better, and especially within problem solving or within like working in, especially from a lot of the field or on-site work that we wound up doing. It's and due to how like quickly turnaround and problem solving winds up happening, it works better when you're a little bit more like mentally flexible. and where those people wind up coming from is, unfortunately, it's a diverse background. So it's not just a 18 to 25-year-olds from, the Midwest or something. It's like really just as the temperament being more of like a open-mindedness or a willingness to sort of interest in exploring and intellectual curiosity, as opposed to it being the strict, engineering from Rochester or something. At least that's what I found from my experience.
And you guys host a resident?
We did, actually.
program?
So this past, just ending in the last couple of weeks, we had a number of fellows and residents that were here. We had, God, how many groups did we had? We had
3 groups.
3 groups.
Three.
So we had
And then
our
the 4th
research
high school group.
Yes, that's right. We had the high school. So, so we had a number of different groups. One was new forms of data representation, which was 2 fellows that were working on a great project that involved capturing satellite signals.
Can you say how they captured them? Because when you told me, it was the coolest.
Yeah, it was pretty
other
amazing.
thing.
So they built their own 2-pole satellite antenna, and then with a specialized radio card was able to first figure out the flight time and location of different satellites. Primarily, they were using NOAA satellites, NASA's weather satellites, and so they'd figure out when they were flying overhead. They'd go out in the parking lot out here and then capture what essentially is an audio signal. So you get like this crazy digital audio signal, then you transcode that back into an image and then turn it into something that you can look at. But they were pairing that with a different system that would influence the way slime molds would grow. So it was something very, very big and then something very, very small that they were using as a way of representing data on both of those scales, which is, I thought it was just a phenomenal project. It was a lot of fun to watch them help them technically figure their work out. Yeah.
Cool. Any other questions? Okay.
Cool.
All right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you guys so much.